now hand over to Sarah Barton, our first speaker.
Good evening, everybody. I hope you can hear me. I have sometimes had some sound issues on this laptop with Zoom. I've been asked to come along and talk generally on the situation in schools, as I understand it, as a member of the Birmingham Socialist Education Association. But I am actually going to speak in quite sort of personal capacity here this evening, because I don't really feel up with all the discussions with the Socialist Education Association on schools at the moment. We haven't really been able to meet in the normal way recently, so I'm going to talk a bit about my experience and my thoughts on the return to school, and in particular from the perspective of a secondary school teacher, which is what I am. So I've jotted down a few notes which I might just check every now and then, if that's okay. So the situation in schools in secondary, as I understand it, is that first of all, schools have had to work incredibly hard in order to try to meet the government guidelines on the return to school, putting in place an absolute enormous range of different measures which are designed to try and keep everybody safe in school, and that has been an enormous task. And you know, those measures have often, you know, changed, and you know, new things have been brought in. So it's been really, really tough for schools to try and get ready. I've been really impressed with my particular school in terms of what they've managed to achieve and how they've managed to do everything in a very short space of time. But I know head teachers have complained and grumbled that there hasn't been, you know, funding to put all of these things in place. So that is an issue. In terms of what's happening in secondary schools, children generally, the general picture seems to be that most children, certainly at Key Stage 3, that's year 7 through to year 9, are staying in one classroom for the whole of their day, and their teachers are travelling to them. So that reduces movement around school. That means that children are less likely to kind of cross paths with other children around school, so there's less risk of transmission. That's the thinking behind it. In my school, the older children in Key Stage 4 are still moving about to go to some of their lessons, and they're staying put for others. I can see the rationale behind this. All sorts of other measures are in place, such as one-way systems, mask wearing in corridors, because Birmingham is in a high transmission area. But my concern with all of this is that all of these measures have been put in place. Schools have worked hard to do them, but I feel they ignore one really important risk, which is the risk of aerosol transmission, which, as I understand it from the science, is, you know, pretty well understood by scientists, that the risk of aerosol transmission in COVID is quite high, and that happens in situations where you've got numbers of people in one space, in one room, for example a classroom, for a period of time, where just a simple process of breathing means that the COVID virus will build up in that space. And that's my main concern in terms of safety in school, is that lots of measures are in place to prevent transmission in corridors with the one-way system, with children not moving about so much. Lots of measures are in place to prevent transmission at break and lunchtime. Everybody has different break and lunch times, and school children are in year group bubbles, and they're not mixing with children who are in another year group bubble, and so on. But nothing really can be or is being done in a meaningful way to prevent the risk of aerosol transmission in the classroom. And our children, and therefore our teaching staff, are spending 5 hours a day in one room with 25 to 30 or maybe even more other individuals. And in that situation, I think it's pretty hard to make that safe. I know in Europe, children are required to wear masks at all times in the classroom as well, and I imagine that would reduce the risk to a certain extent, but that's not required here. Here, we're in Birmingham, we're requiring children to wear masks when they move around in the corridors or when they're in lunch or break time spaces. But that actually is those are the safer spaces in school. The areas where they are most at risk is where they are in their classroom, when they are there for 5 hours with the same people, all breathing the same space, the same air. In theory, windows and doors are kept open to keep the rooms as ventilated as possible. That's going to become less and less practical as the weather changes and the weather gets colder. So I really feel that's the biggest safety concern. I feel that in terms of children's well-being and mental health, it has been really clear that they are happy to be back in school. They want to be back in school. It will be doing them good. You know, some of the children, when they came back, you could sort of see something wasn't right, you know, and then they've gradually come back and become more themselves as school has settled in. So I think having that experience of coming into school is really important. My feeling is that we shouldn't be cramming 25 to 30 children in a room for 5 hours together, and that there are ways for children to have that social school experience without putting them and their teachers at that level of risk, but that these options haven't been considered. I feel that there ought to be some sort of blended learning going on, where perhaps they are doing part of their week at home online, and that would make sense for certain lessons more than others, and that they then have a part-time experience in school, so that they can come in and work in smaller numbers, which can be kept safe, and they can still have the interaction with the face-to-face interaction with teachers and with their classmates and so on, and benefit from all of that. But I feel these things haven't been considered, and I suspect the reason that they haven't been considered is that with this government, the children's education and welfare really isn't, whatever they've said, it really isn't the priority. I feel that the priority has been to get children back in school for childcare reasons, so that the parents can go out to work. And I understand that it is a difficult balance, you know, however we fit, whatever we feel the purpose of school education is, the reality is that it also does serve as childcare for parents to go out to work. But I feel that the children's education, well-being and health, and the health and well-being of their families and their communities, in terms of them bringing that disease back into their families and their communities, shouldn't be the thing that suffers in order to solve that other social, you know, issue, economic issue of whether parents can afford to go out to work. You know, I feel that other things should have been looked at, but I don't think that's even been considered. So that's kind of where I am in my own mind. In terms of the other issue, I think, is that information. There seems to be a complete lack of actual information being shared with professionals in school, but also with parents. As you know, we're not having the daily briefings anymore. We don't know what the rates are in school. We've got some idea if we're teachers in school. We've got, you know, colleagues who work in other schools. There's a lot of talk about what's going on. Our head teachers are talking to each other, and they're getting an idea from talking to each other, but there isn't any official sharing of information about what the situation is in school, how going back to school has impacted on the levels of the virus, and how much of the virus increasing has been responsible by the return to school. And I think we're kind of working in a kind of an information vacuum in that respect, and I don't think that's a very good idea. I think we ought to be being open and honest, and we ought to be being given this information so that we can make judgments, so that everybody, parents should have this information, teachers should have this information. It's all very anecdotal at the moment. I know from my head teacher, he shared with our staff in the middle of last week information that he'd gleaned, that there were 96 bubbles in Birmingham that had burst. That was the middle of last week. So that means there would have been 96 groups of children within which there had been an outbreak. Now, some of that will have been multiple bubbles at individual schools, So I don't know how many individual schools were affected, but that was the situation as reported by my head teacher middle of last week. But I feel that this sort of information ought to be being reported by the local authority. We ought to know it, really, and so that we can all make informed choices and decisions. So I think I'm going to stop there, if that's okay, and then happy to answer any questions.
Yes, thank you, Sarah. What we'll do is we'll hear from Kate Taylor, and then we'll take clusters of questions for both of you. We'll see how many people have got questions. But Kate, would you like to unmute and come in?
Yeah, hi. So I'm Kate Taylor, and I'm a teacher in Birmingham, and then I'm also a member of the SEA with Sarah. And as she said, we haven't really, we haven't been able to meet. So in terms of us talking on an SEA line, it's a bit tricky. But similarly to Sarah, I'm just going to share some of my personal experiences. So I wanted to focus a little bit on SEND and the impact that the coronavirus and the whole period really has had on SEND families, and thoughts on what we do moving forward. So I've got a son who is autistic. He's 18, goes to special school, special college. And initially it was very interesting because when we first locked down, it was like the rest of the world joined us really, because when you've got a child with special needs, you don't go out and you don't go to parties and you don't go to the pub and you don't go to restaurants. Nobody comes around to your house. And it was really interesting because actually our lives are on lockdown all the time, and it was interesting to see other people panicking and experiencing the level of isolation that majority of SEND families experience every single day of their lives. When schools closed, that was also interesting because the government line was that children who were vulnerable, so children who had an EHCP, would still be in school. And that just wasn't a reality at all. So I work in a mainstream school, and none of our children, none of our SEND children, none of the children with EHCPs could come back because we couldn't make it safe for them if we stuck to the guidelines that schools were given. And then my son, as I said, goes to a special school, and even though they had a different set of guidelines, in the very first instance, and with me being a key worker as well, so within those first few months, he wasn't invited back to school because not so much that they couldn't make it safe for him, but he wasn't a priority, and it was taking so much staff and so much of their resources to look out for the children who were more vulnerable than he was, that he couldn't go back in at first. So I think it's really interesting. The government said that they were looking after those children and they weren't, and it's no surprise, is it, because the government don't look after children with special needs and they don't look after those families. It was interesting watching him throughout lockdown, in the longer period of lockdown, because actually he had far less anxiety. And even though he is a child who goes to a special school and it's an autistic provision, school is a very anxious place for children with special needs. And from what I can glean just from sort of talking to people and looking at things on Facebook, I think it's about half and half for children who actually found that period really settling. There was no waiting for the bus. There was no worrying about who was going to be in that day. There were no routines that might be broken. There was no general anxiety about going to school. And lots of those children really thrived at home, just with their immediate family in a safe space. So I think that's really interesting. Let me just have a think. Sorry, so I look at my notes. Oh, so I think that as that period of time continued, families then began to really feel the pinch. There was no more respite. The carers weren't able to come. Personal assistants weren't able to come. Any little bit of support that families had just ebbed away because people couldn't go into each other's houses. For me, my son has somebody who comes to visit him once a week, and they go out and talk through all his anxieties with her, and she couldn't come. So it definitely had a profound impact on SEND families, because even though we always feel abandoned, and we truly were abandoned, and any support we did have completely disappeared. during that time, the laws were changed. So in the Families Act, there was a law change there to say that actually schools didn't need to provide what was stated on the EHCP. So any provision that children did have that was on their EHCP, that was taken away. And as far as I'm aware, that hasn't been reinstated. I think those laws will be in place for some time, which is a real concern, because getting what is on your child's EHCP to actually happen in school is really hard work anyway, even though it's a legal document. And now actually that's being taken away. So there is no compulsion now for placements to provide what's written in the EHCP. So again, there's another battle for SEND families to work through, and that's a battle I think that we need to have collectively on a national level. Really, it's not something that families can do independently, but a huge impact of the coronavirus on those families. It's a time when, you know, we need more support, and everybody needs support at the moment. You know, it's a very, very difficult time, and we understand that, but you know, these children and these families need more, and of course they're being offered less. I think that in terms of the shielding ending, that was a lot of that, you know, we think of as adults who are shielding, but there are many, many children with special needs who are shielding, and that ended, meaning that those children had to go back to school, even though families didn't necessarily feel that that was a safe environment for them. And that's a real concern for thousands of families across the country. Schools are trying to do their best to make those placements secure for those children, but special schools apparently think that about 15% of families just won't come back for whatever reason that might be. And in terms of that, parents not feeling safe to send children back, I do know that Birmingham City Council aren't fining families who aren't sending their children back. However, they're not advertising this for obvious reasons. And so families are sending their children in, even though they don't want to, because they are fearful of receiving a fine from a city council who aren't going to fine them. So that sort of sticks a little bit really with me. I think the Birmingham City Council should be proud of the fact that they're not going to fine families who don't feel safe in school. They shouldn't be hiding from that. So I think that, you know, as I say, SEND families, we always sort of feel like we're at the bottom of the pile, and certainly coronavirus has just made that worse. Like I said, there are some benefits, and some of those families and some of those children quite enjoyed lockdown. They quite enjoyed the comfort of that. But moving forward, I think it's something that we really need to fight for, and particularly around the laws that have had, you know, had an impact on EHCPs. I know for me, my son, his EHCP was updated, sent to be updated in March, just before lockdown. So it's anyone's guess as to when that will come through, whether it will get processed at all. You know, so all those processes that take so long now will just take all that, you know, all that much longer. So yeah, so I think it's been, like I say, it's been a very difficult time for SEND children, and I think moving forward, schools really need to be aware of that, and you know, and really try and support the SEND children they have, and their families as well. So yeah, that's me.
Thank you, Kate. Can I just ask you a question before we open to general questions? You've just used a 4-letter acronym there, and I don't know what it stands for. EHCP.
Oh, sorry. Okay, so that's an education healthcare plan, which replaces the old statement of special needs. Does that sound familiar?
Yes,
yeah.
That does, yes.
It marries together education and health, puts both of them together in one document, sorry.
That's okay.
And it's special educational needs and disabilities, so that also changed when you got the HCP. All right.
Okay, thank you. Now, has anybody besides me got questions that they'd like to ask of either of the two speakers that we've just heard from? If you have, could you please put up your hands using that raised hand? Okay. So I'll bring in Ruth Clark first, please. You can unmute, Ruth.
Thanks, Andrea, and thanks to the speakers. I think what Kate said was pretty alarming. And I was working with inner city kids in a summer school, and found that, you know, their situation was bad enough. And what was the most concerning for me was that they didn't seem to mind being at home and not doing anything. And they weren't learning. They are now, they're back at school, and hopefully will catch up, but one wonders. But, you know, I just worry about families with special needs children who aren't articulate and can't fight for them. And you just really worry, don't you? But what I was, in response to what Sarah said, there was an article in The Guardian, I think it was Saturday, about some research that's going on at Bristol University about the coronavirus and its transmission. And you might like to look it up. Stated the 26th of September. And what they're saying is, we know that when bacterial viruses become airborne and respiratory droplets, they very quickly dry down and can lose viability. So that's an important step to understand when assessing the role of airborne transmission in COVID-19. Now that sounds very reassuring, but later on, it says that they think the half-life of COVID is 1.1 to 1.2 hours. So it's viable, possibly for up to 3 hours, because, you know, half-life is half of the viruses have died. And I mean, this is the start of their research, but it does sort of imply that airborne viruses hang around for quite a long time. And obviously, if you're in a room that's not well ventilated, you must be at risk. I don't know if they'll go on and look at how important the concentration of the virus is, because that's another factor. But it is quite worrying, and I would suggest that you try and look up this research, and you know, sort of, let's all try and follow it and see what they come up with, because I think they're basically saying that if you're in a closed room with 30 kids, you must be at risk potentially. So, you know, scary stuff. I just thought I'd cheer you up with that.
Thank you, Ruth. Would either Kate or I've lost the other, Sarah, like to respond to that, or shall I just move on to the next question? Is there anything you'd like to add to that?
I'll just say that yes, I also have seen research which shows that aerosol transmission, i.e. being in an enclosed space for a longer period of time, is a high risk, and I think the evidence is really clear on it. But I also saw a well-written piece, I'm sorry I haven't got the link to show you, which explained that actually the World Health Organization has got a very long historical kind of resistance to recognizing aerosol transmission in disease. And it's a really odd story. It goes all the way back to kind of the 19th century, when scientists were trying to battle against the notion of bad air, that people had this notion that there was bad air. Yeah. And as a result of trying to combat those ideas at the time, there's been a historical resistance to acknowledge that some diseases are transmitted through aerosol transmission. And it seems extraordinary that in 2020 they wouldn't acknowledge that, when they do know that diseases like measles, for example, are transmitted through aerosol transmission. And the evidence is very strong that COVID is also transmitted in that way, and that's actually one of the main routes of transmission. and the kind of the route that wearing a kind of a face covering might discourage is kind of less likely, which is kind of more sort of large droplets of moisture coming from somebody's mouth actually coming and landing on you, which is really quite unlikely and quite rare. And that's why we're asked to wear face masks in shops and so on. But the aerosol transmission was described in a piece. I'll try and find a link and send it through perhaps to Jo, perhaps, and she can share it. It was described as being, if you imagine somebody smoking a cigarette, you can see the aerosol transmission in a cigarette because it's also mixed in with other substances that move about in the air in that way. And if you're in a room with 25 people who are all smoking cigarettes, you know how quickly that fills that space. That was the analogy that was used by the scientists to explain aerosol transmission. So if you are in a room for 5 hours with 25 to 30 other people, you will be at risk, at higher risk. And I just can't think of anybody else in society who is being asked to do this. But we're asking all of our school children to do this, and we're asking all of our teachers to do this. And I just can't think of another situation where that is happening. In other work situations, numbers are changed, people are in smaller groups, people are at a distance. We're not even at a social distance. The children can't be at a social distance because you can't sit socially distanced. You can't fit 30 children in a room socially distanced. The teachers are asked to socially distance if they can, but most of the time you can't. So, and actually the reality of teaching children, even secondary children, is that you cannot. It's just not possible. I can't get through a single day staying 2 meters away from a child. It's just not possible. And in primary school, early years, and so on, it's just impossible. So we're not even getting the 2 meter social distance, but I really feel that it's the aerosol transmission that has been overlooked.
Thank you, Sarah. If I could, Kate, do you want to come back on that, and then we'll move on to the next question?
I suppose it just makes me think that when you look at the risk assessments that schools are providing, they look great, and they talk about cleaning and they talk about well ventilated rooms, and the guidance talks about all these things to go on the risk assessment. And it's the reality of it, as Sarah says, that these things can't happen. Teachers won't have their windows open in the winter. They just won't. There's people talking about their classrooms already being 10 degrees. I mean, 10 degrees, who can work in 10 degrees, and be in that environment? So I think it's a way where schools are saying, and they're not, it's not their fault, it's been imposed on them, that this is making your children safe and this is making the staff safe. But actually the risk assessments, that they're not going to happen, and I think that's a big worry for me, because it feels like the risk assessment is a fallback for the government and it's a fallback for the school, but they're just not practical, and they can't happen, and they don't account for what's coming in, like the aerosol transmission, and the fact that we can't socially distance, and the fact that children sneeze in your face and things like that. You can't risk assess that, can you? So that's my concern, is that the risk assessments look good on paper, in reality they can't happen.
Okay, thank you. Can I ask now, the next question is from Jo Shemmons.
Hi, and thank you. I was particularly interested in what Kate said, because my grandson has verbal dyspraxia, which is a speech and communication disorder. He doesn't have an education healthcare plan yet because he can't quite get one, but he does have an SEN plan. And it's really interesting because they're quite keen to get him back into school and sit in a classroom full of 30 children all day. Like Kate mentioned, like a lot of children with SEN, he thrived in the 6 months that he was off. He lives in a multi-generational household, and he really enjoyed it. And his speech has actually come on leaps and bounds in that 6 months. But it's like the fact that he can be in a classroom with 30 children and his teacher, in a bubble of 120 apparently, he can't have his one-on-one speech therapy back, because apparently the NHS can't afford to make it safe. So he can't sit in a room with one person and have proper speech therapy. You can go online and have about 20 minutes of speech therapy, which, as you can imagine, for a 5-year-old, asking them to sit and stare at a camera on your phone or on your laptop for that amount of time is really difficult. But he can't have his proper speech therapy, which is the most important thing for him. So it seems to be counterproductive in saying children have got to be back in school, but for SEN children particularly, they're not, as you said, they're not getting the support that they need. And I suppose the question, I'm not sure you have the answer really, is what can we do to push back and say, well, you've kind of insisted that these children have to come back into school, but at the same time, you're not giving them the support that they need. How can we kind of push back against that? So I guess that was, I'm not sure you have the answer, but that was kind of my question.
Yeah, I mean, I think it has to be on a bigger scale, doesn't it? So there are groups online. So I know that Special Needs Jungle are a really good organisation, and they're certainly pushing for greater support. And it's trying to approach it collectively, isn't it? Maybe in terms of emailing counsellors and trying to push the council, which is something that I find quite tricky. To sort of speak up for these children and support them and do the right thing. It's just about hassling, isn't it? And being that irritating voice. And I often find that being the irritating voice and sending the email every day, it does have results, because they just want you to be quiet. But unfortunately, I mean, it's true, because what Ruth said, because actually if you are a family that hasn't got the confidence to do that, you're not going to get anything, are you? And that's a proper tragedy. But yeah, I think it's working collectively, isn't it? Trying to get those bigger groups together and sort of trying to join in with, campaigns which are happening nationally to try and get that support. But no, it's horrible. It really is.
Thank you, Kate. We've got 2 more questions before we move on to the next speakers. The next question is from Jean Brandt, and then the last question will be from Frida.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Sarah Kate. I really feel for you. And I'm just wondering what helps with your morale is one issue. Another thing, thinking about allies and who could give push to some of these issues, are school nurses at all involved in this? Giving a little shout out to my own profession.
Yeah, there's no school nurses, are there? I think that's been completely knocked on the head.
Yeah.
Somebody did raise it recently, actually, in another meeting that I was at about school nurses. And there's no way school nurses are back in any supportive way, because that would be wonderful, because there's so many children in schools now who've got sore throats and headaches and coughs and sneezes. And it'd be great if we could try and organise those children to the ones that are just got a cold and the ones that we think are likely to have COVID. But no, I don't think there's any input from school nurses, unfortunately.
I'm very shocked to hear that.
Yeah.
I thought there'd be more at the moment.
No, not at all. No. No, I missed your first point, sorry.
Again, about, how is morale among, both parents and teachers, and what can be done about that? I think Sarah talked about the students are enjoying going back, but I think it must be awfully stressful for the teachers. Could Yeah,
it's very. I don't know, morale's surprisingly okay at my school. We've had 3 bubbles off, and we have got staff members who've tested positive. And that was a real wake-up call for the rest of the staff, who were I don't mean it like that, but they were feeling this sort of, well, we've just got to get on with it, let's crack on, the kids are here and we need to get on with it. And we then had 3 staff members test positive, and that's certainly changed mood, definitely. But, surprisingly, morale is very, very high. It's good. I think, if anything, it's brought people together and, made people sort of solidify their bonds. So that's been quite surprising. But there is a lot of fear. There are staff who are scared.
I would just add to that. I would say that I think on one level morale is quite high, because people in a crisis do tend to pull together. And I think that's what's happening, but that, I think, doesn't perhaps reflect the actual levels of anxiety, underlying levels of anxiety that staff are feeling. I know from myself, my own levels of anxiety have been really quite high in going back, and I have been very anxious about picking up the virus and transmitting it back to other people who I know are more vulnerable than me, within my circle, my family, and so on. I know from conversations I've had with other members of staff that some of them are also feeling, very anxious for similar reasons. And I think coping with the enormous amount of change in terms of just managing the school day has been very stressful, and people are going home absolutely exhausted at the end of the day. And I do wonder how sustainable this is, because we are, in secondary school, we are moving about and might be teaching in 5 different classrooms during the day. Breaks and lunches in my school, and I think this is quite common, have been really cut down to a minimum. So lunch break is 25 minutes. And this is so that you can give all the year group bubbles a separate lunch break when they're not going to be with other people. And the shape of your school day is different every single day in secondary, depending on which year groups you'll teach, which mix of year groups you're teaching that day. So you never know where you are. You're always having to check a timetable, or when's my break today, when's my break. Sometimes just depending on quirks of the timetable, you might have to, if you've got a class that has an early break and another class that has a late lunch, you'll be with on their break, their lunch. So you might have 3 hours in the middle of the day where you haven't got a toilet break, things like that. So it's been really stressful just coping with the logistics of that sort of thing. And then the one-way system in our building anyway means that it takes forever to get anywhere. And you're kind of, I was sort of in a science lab teaching a year 9. They had a lunch break in the middle of their lesson, because that's the quirk of the way it is now. So they did sort of 25 minutes, then they went off a 25-minute lunch break, and then they were back for 35 minutes. Now in that 25 minutes, if I'm going to go somewhere to get my lunch, make a cup of coffee and go to the toilet, I've got to do the one-way system once to get there and then again to get back. And it's like, is it worth actually leaving this science lab and trying to do this? It's just, those sort of things just add an awful lot of stress to your day and make you even tireder at the end. And I feel as well that because all of this stuff is taking up mental headspace, that there is less left, there's less resources left for good teaching. And so I know that my lessons, I'm an art teacher, and I'm now teaching art in a lab, or or in what was an English room, whatever. They're not nearly as exciting and varied as perhaps they could be, because I just don't have the mental resources and the energy there, whilst coping with this strange shape to the school day, to sort of plan for that and move everything with me on my trolley, from one class to another. So it's, I think it might prove to be very difficult for teachers to sustain this. I think they are doing a great job at the moment, but if this was to carry on like this for, a significant length of time, then I think people will be struggling. And I think we will see. I mean, at the moment, attendance levels in my school are really high, and there's very few people off sick, and we haven't yet had a COVID outbreak in my school. I think we must be one of the few schools that hasn't had any. And I think people are really kind of pulling out all the stops to try and keep things going. But that, as I say, I'm not sure how sustainable that will be over a long period of time.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you. Can we move on now to Frida? Frida, would you like to unmute?
Yeah. Right. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. I was just remembering when people were starting to say we've got to think of a different way of doing education when we were during the lockdown, and certainly what popped up in my mind and was being talked about was the smaller classes and the mix and match approach to education, which seems to me could be very positive, and possibly if you had those smaller classes, you would have fewer logistic problems in getting round. So I'm sad that that doesn't, and I understand as well that it's because of getting people back to work. But when you think of what is being done in workplaces of fewer people coming in, I know I have a nephew who their work day extends from 7 in the morning till 10 at night, but they're not all in there so that they can come in at different times. And for some people, that's really he's in a lab, so it's doable, and a lot of attention is given as to what times are more suitable for whom. For instance, he's happy to start work at 7, but what I do know though is that this is very possible in the environment of a lab, for instance, but not in some of the lower paid jobs. But it does still seem very important that doesn't slide off the agenda, because what we've got now does seem unsustainable, and there seems like nothing is being allowed to give. And I'm an ex-teacher, so a little sort of pressure on the prescriptive nature of the curriculum would be helpful. And the other thought I have, which is something I've been very concerned about, is that the failure of any outsourced staff to have anything but statutory sick pay that starts after 3 days, and then you only get very much less than the minimum wage. It's 92 quid. And as I understand it, lots of schools have outsourced cleaning staff. It would appear that most cleaners in this country don't have a proper sick pay, and therefore are always likely to not be able to afford to not go into work when they're feeling a bit poorly. So it would be good. I mean, there is a campaign out there about making statutory sick pay start on day 1 and be a living wage, rather than the paltry thing that we have now. And it's just one channel of transmission that one could close off across a lot of workplaces, including leisure centres, those who clean our public transport, are outsourced, etc. So I was just making a link with that. But I do think it feels like nothing's being allowed to give, and certainly the smaller classes would have been a positive outcome.
Kate, Sarah, would you like to come back on that?
I'll come back. Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think there hasn't been enough proper thinking about how we can find a different way. I think there could be the option, even for parents to choose to keep their children at home. Those parents who can keep their children at home without it impacting on them economically could be doing so. Schools could be open for the children who really need to be there, either because they're vulnerable or because their parents don't have other options for childcare, and that would reduce the numbers significantly, and would enable us to be able to provide a much safer environment for those children in school, and safer for the staff as well. I really feel that there ought to be an assumption that there will be some sort of blended learning where all children have some time in school and most children have time at home learning as well, and only those children who really need to be in school all the time would be in school all the time. And I don't see why that isn't possible to do, but I just think nobody has actually sat down and seriously considered it as an option. And I think it's a great shame. I think there are lots of children. I mean, when the children that I was teaching last week, when we had a rule change, because it was clear that levels were rising in the city, So we had a rule change that children are to wear their masks at all times in between lessons, even if they're out of doors. And so it sort of explained that to the children. And the first question that came back is, why aren't we just learning from home? You know, why do we have to be here if it's not safe? And, you know, the children themselves are asking these questions. And, you know, I think many parents would be able and would be willing to support a mixed kind of picture of some learning from home, some learning in school. And I really feel that ought to be being enabled.
Thank you, Sarah. Kate?
Just really quickly to say that, you know, I completely agree with that. It should have been organised and it should have been planned. And unfortunately, what you've got now is that both are happening, because you've got children who are isolating within a class and the class are at school. And if a child's isolating because there's a family member, say, showing symptoms, then the school are obliged to send home learning. So in terms of what Sarah was talking about and sustainability, you've got teachers who are teaching a full curriculum all day at school and providing home learning for the children who are isolating at home. That's not in any way sustainable. And what we've also got is, you know, is teachers in school who are clinically vulnerable or clinically extremely vulnerable, who could be at home providing learning for those children who are also at home, either self-isolating or because they're vulnerable. There's so much that could have been done. And actually what we've got is just a complete mess. And, you know, something that, as Sarah said so well, is just not sustainable. Teachers can't teach all day and then provide home learning as well, which is what they're doing at the moment. So yeah, it should have been better planned. Somebody should have just asked the teachers, really. That would have helped.
Absolutely, absolutely. And on that stunning note, whoever would have thought we could have asked teachers? Can I bring in Saima Suleiman, please? Would you like to unmute and join us with your contribution, Saima?
Hi, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to speak today. My name's Saima Suleiman. I'm a trade unionist with the PCS Union. I currently work at Spark Hill Job Centre in Birmingham. We're currently battling the government with their call for bringing in more customers into it. So I think in the way that the government overall has dealt with this pandemic has just totally, you know, been ridiculous, really. I'll have a lot of those moments where the children walk in.
That's fine.
I'm sorry, I think I got thrown out. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah, we can hear you now. Yes, you might need to rewind a bit. I think we lost a bit there.
Okay. Oh yeah. So I've got 4 children, all 4 are in varying sort of education settings at the moment. So my eldest is in university. I have a daughter in college, and then one in just starting secondary school, and one in primary school. So straight away, I think. My son, who's just started secondary school, he's got autism. He's got a diagnosis of autism and ADHD. He's kind of one of the children that sort of falling on the kind of borderline where it's not seen as severe enough that he needs too much extra help, but he does need extra support, and a lot of his issues are around anxiety. So when obviously going to a new school was a huge thing for him, but because of the pandemic, he couldn't have the usual steps that are taken with children before they start a new school. So there was a lot of anxiety and everything like that. And like Joe mentioned and Kate mentioned, I think he was fine with being at home. I couldn't really get him focus or do anything, but he was happy and content, and I think that was enough for me. And all of the children were sort of really excited and glad to be back. But straight away, within the first week of them going back, my son developed a temperature. So it was within the first week, and then it was a slight panic. And I think until until you actually experience it in your close circle, that sort of the illness or anything like that, I think you don't realize exactly how serious this all is. So within the first week of him going back to school, he developed a temperature and was quite poorly. And then so I had to phone all the schools and let everyone know. I had to phone the college, university, let everybody know that this is the situation. And then I tried booking a test. And I don't know if anyone's tried to book a test, but it is a nightmare trying to book a test. Couldn't get a test. So I think the whole family were just like panicking, because your life sort of comes to a standstill, because you can't do anything until you get the test, and then it's the worry. And I think with my son, he could hear us like talking. We tried not to talk in front of him, but he's like, "Because have I got?" He was like, "Have I got COVID? Am I going to die?" Like just complete, panic. And for some, because really, really got so stressed and so anxious. And I think the 3 days it took sort of to get the test and get the results. And I think those 3 days were just like really, really, anxious for the whole family, because we all had to isolate. Now for parents, like for example, my husband, who sort of gets paid for when he works, he couldn't work. So obviously he was off work for the few days until the test results came clear. For myself, I'm more lucky. I'm actually working from home at the moment, so it's easier for me to kind of get the time off. And I think that's one thing that I've noticed with a lot of parents is the test, is trying to get the test. It's been an absolute nightmare. And what I have to say through all of this, I think whether it's been in the primary school, secondary school, or in college, or in the university, I think the teachers have been absolutely fantastic. I have to say that they've been absolutely amazing. My sister works in the school as well. She's a teaching assistant, and sort of the way that the government have treated teachers, or the way that they make them feel, I think it's unlike in any other sector that you will find, that the way they've tried to demonize or villainize teachers if they're showing their concerns. And I think they've been absolutely brilliant and really, really supportive. And the way that they've adapted to things, and they go above and beyond with the children. I think. I mean, that's what my personal experience has been, and it's a constant battle. I think as parents, as a trade unionist, I mean, even in my workplace as well, it's a constant battle with the government trying to get away with as much breaking as much health and safety as they can, and it's a constant and ongoing battle. And I think as parents, the impact again is especially on lower paid workers, or workers who can't go to work because of children being off, because of having to self-isolate. It's impacting their financial situation. But again, teachers and schools shouldn't be put in that position to sort of to be held responsible for that, if that makes sense. In no way whatsoever, because it's the government's responsibility. And I think we really do need parents to, because I know that some teachers have said that they're kind of getting it from all ways. So they're getting it from the government, and sometimes they can get it from parents as well, sort of, who are complaining for whatever reasons. But I think there does need to be like perhaps a movement from parents to kind of support the teachers, I mean, I would definitely be up for it because I really think that the teachers have been amazing. You know, from my experience, in particular with all of my children. So yeah, I mean, that's really all I have to say.
Andrea, you're on mute, I think.
Yes, sorry, I'm asking somebody else to unmute. Well, I've muted myself. Okay. So yes, can we have Kate answer? Can you unmute, Kate?
Yes, I can. Hi everyone. Thanks for having me along today, and really interesting to hear all the speakers so far. I've got some slides if everyone's okay for me to share them. I hope, and I'm aware that we haven't got lots of time, so I'll try and whiz through. I can't share my screen at the moment, could someone make me the host or enable me to share my screen?
Joe, do you know how to do that?
While that's happening, oh yeah, I guess what I'm going to sort of try and cover. So I'm from Child Poverty Action Group. So I wanted to talk today about sort of poverty and education, particularly looking at sort of the impact of COVID on families and kind of family finances. Then I'm going to talk through some research that we carried out during lockdown. Let's have a look so I can share my screen now.
I've made you the co-host, Kate, if that helps.
Oops, yeah, that helps.
Yeah, great.
Okay. Can everyone see that okay?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Yes, so I'll talk a bit about COVID more generally and sort of the impact on finances. Then I'll talk about some research that we carried out during school closures. But I suppose importantly, a lot of the learning from that is very relevant now as more and more children are sort of off school. Just some of the things that were really helpful during school closures and some of the things that we can take from it and we can learn about going forward. Then I'm going to pick up on some sort of additional challenges that I think are coming through at the moment that are particularly sort of affecting women. And then finally, I'll look at some things I think the education sector sort of needs to consider as we're moving forward. But I'll try and kind of go through quite quickly with the time that we have. So first of all, just to kind of set the scene, I think this is probably quite a common metaphor that lots of people have heard already, but I think it's really helpful that we're all kind of in this same COVID storm, but we're all in very different boats. So COVID has had this kind of very disastrous impact on family finances, but some families have very much been able to stay afloat because they've had sort of various protections in place, but other families have been kind of pulled into poverty because their incomes have been slashed or sort of disappeared altogether. At this stage, I think it's worth saying we don't know exactly what this will mean for poverty levels. It's sort of quite complicated to work out, but it has been estimated that over 200,000 children will be pushed into poverty as a result of the pandemic. So in terms of, I suppose, what this means for families kind of more practically or like in sort of real terms, it means the same as poverty has always meant, but we're just in I guess a sort of particularly unique situation and on a much larger scale. So there's kind of poverty comes with a huge amount of stress and worry and just not having enough money for your family to get by. There was some research carried out during lockdown that showed sort of some of the realities of that. So families on benefits having to cut back on essentials such as food, lots of families having to borrow money during that time and continuing to, and then families falling behind on kind of rent and bills. And as you can imagine, there's sort of obvious effects on family well-being because of all those stresses and worries. I think, and I'm sure that those of you who kind of work in schools will probably maybe know this already, but obviously as schools are kind of reopening, as children were coming back, the children that are returning to school might be in very kind of different financial situations than they were previously. So some of them may be in kind of deeper poverty now, or some of them might be experiencing it for the very first time. And I think what's sort of difficult for schools and established institutions is that the typical data that you would look at to sort of try and identify families that might be struggling is no longer that useful to us. So children will still be in the same kind of houses that they were in previously. So that kind of IMD data won't tell us much. Children who won't necessarily be eligible for free school meals because that threshold for free school meals is so low, but also families may not have disclosed their situation yet to schools or applied for free school meals. So it's really difficult for us to know who might be struggling at school. And I suppose what this means, and I'll kind of come back to this point, but what this means for education is that there's a sort of greater need for schools to be kind of generally poverty aware and make sure that policies and practices throughout the school day kind of have a poverty lens on them, and that they're not adding any additional burden, I suppose, to families who might be feeling financial pressures. So, as I mentioned, we've been carrying on sort of doing research during the pandemic and during school closures about how income affects children's experiences. And I think it's just really pick up on the point that Sama made about kind of teachers and schools. We found through the research that we carried out with families and children, lots were saying kind of that schools had gone above and beyond, and they were making kind of incredible efforts to reach out to families and to support them. So I think that really came through, but there were some things that we found were really helpful, and some things that kind of required or needed a lot more improvement that maybe we can kind of learn from going forward. In terms of the research, we asked about kind of broad range of topics that I'll talk about, but 94% of the respondents to the parent survey were females. And I think that kind of tells its own story about sort of who's more predominantly involved in children's learning at home and who sort of takes on those responsibilities. But yeah, I'd encourage you to sort of read the quotes as I go along, because they're sort of the experiences of women and children during this period. So the biggest finding, or the thing that I think the thing that I would take away, is that the financial pressures and sort of cost burdens that were associated with school closures were falling kind of greatest or heaviest on the families that could least afford it. So we were seeing that those that had kind of the greatest money concerns were the people that, or the families that were kind of forking out in order to catch up or in order to keep up with other families, which I think is sort of very concerning. In terms of, some more of the detail, we found that 40% of low-income families were missing an essential resource, and I'm sure you'll have seen kind of lots of information about this, but ICT was a particular challenge, with lots of families kind of sharing phones or not having compatible devices or programs, and some families not having kind of devices at all. So this kind of shift to digital learning that was brought about by the pandemic, it really required families to have that appropriate technology, or otherwise it was kind of very likely that they would miss out. And we heard lots of parents talking about their concerns of sort of seeing children falling behind, but also seeing children feeling really frustrated and cut off from their peers and from their teachers. As I said, some children did have a sort of good time over lockdown, as we've kind of heard, and a lot of that was to do with where teachers were able to stay in touch quite regularly, where they could get regular feedback on their work. Anything that kind of kept that link alive between home and school was really helpful to families. But again, often that really relied on having kind of the technology in place. And I think, as I said, that sort of point about families with the greatest money concerns sort of spending the most, I think it's an important point to think about, because there's lots of assumptions that low-income families sort of don't engage as much in their children's learning, but actually what we saw was this kind of huge amount of care and concern from parents trying to support their children's learning, but just facing these kind of multiple barriers in order to do so. I've just included this here, and I think this sort of touches on some of the stuff we were saying earlier. We heard a lot of kind of women and mums really trying to help out and sort of do their bit, but for a whole range of reasons, it was incredibly difficult. So lots of women said, were trying to still work themselves at home, or they were looking after younger children, or they just didn't have the confidence to support their children's learning. And this was even more so, or kind of an even more difficult for lone parents, which of course sort of tend to be women. And as I kind of mentioned, there was other research that showed that women were doing kind of considerably more childcare, including homeschooling, during lockdown, and that kind of came through. So I think this quote just sort of illustrates that idea. And I think what a lot of women felt during lockdown was just trying to juggle everything, and kind of keep up and be all things all the time, which, as we know, is incredibly kind of overwhelming. In terms of free school meals, we spoke to lots of families about free school meals, and the thing that came through was just how much families appreciated replacements for free school meals in such kind of uncertain times. Lots of families reported increasing costs at home, and therefore any help with kind of food was welcomed. We did carry out research across England, Scotland and Wales. And in Scotland and Wales, lots of local authorities were providing replacement free school meals as cash payments directly to bank accounts. And that was by far the kind of had the highest satisfaction levels for families, being able to sort of have that money directly into their bank accounts so they can choose the shops that they want to shop in. They can get the food that they know their children will like. They can make sure it's good value. And there wasn't that kind of embarrassment that came with, that many families kind of reported coming with the voucher scheme that we had here in England. So I think that's sort of important to think about any of these schemes going forward, that, yeah, where we can take a sort of cash first approach, it's really appreciated by families. The other thing was just around financial support in general. Families found it quite difficult to get access to financial support, and often they were kind of trying to use systems or processes for the first time. So this kind of 1 in 3 families said it was really difficult to find kind of the support that they needed. But where schools were kind of really sending out lots of regular information, contacting families, this was kind of hugely appreciated. And I think there was a point about kind of communication and kindness was really valued in terms of school communication. Nearly there. So we also asked about kind of support around well-being, and the thing that came up most, and I've sort of touched on this already, is just contact with schools. So there were so many brilliant examples of schools who had been setting up virtual assemblies, phone calls, Zoom classrooms, one-to-one lessons, and children and young people told us just how much they enjoyed these sessions, especially as they were missing friends and teachers, and this was kind of a great way to sort of socialise. But then kind of looking at that on the flip side, though, if those are the things that children enjoyed most, then those children that weren't able to access them were kind of missing out on something that others were kind of hugely benefiting from. So just that point about the digital divide, it came through really strongly in this research. I will keep going. So I think a really important point, and this sort of links back to what I said at the beginning, was just that it's going to be really difficult for us to identify families who are in poverty and sort of know what their needs are. But it's really important for us to not make assumptions and kind of ask families what they need in terms of support. So this is Hannah. She was a mum on a low income, and she just didn't have what she needed at home, but no one kind of asked her what resources she had or whether she knew how to use things. And she kind of just told us that would have been something that would have greatly helped if someone had sort of tried to understand her situation. And again, this is recognising, I know schools have limited time, but it seemed a very important point that came through. So I suppose other things that have, since schools have been reopening, things that seem to have come up is just that there is still obviously kind of a lack of childcare available in terms of women trying to sort of get back into work or continue their jobs. Although we might think that lots of children are back at school, there's still challenges for women, particularly around having younger children still at home, so not being able to work, also having to kind of be there for school pickups and drop-offs, and the timings of those sort of interfering with the workday potentially. So I think there still is, it's still very difficult for women to maybe get back to their original sort of working patterns. And I think that's there's kind of a further point there around the extended schools programs. So these are anything that school offers that's outside of core hours. And I think lots of extended school programs have potentially not restarted, and there's sort of obvious reasons for that because of logistics. But in terms of then, I suppose from the family perspective, some of those extended schools programs do really support families to be able to work longer hours, etc. So I suppose there's a kind of conversation there about if schools are able to reopen some of these programs, the benefits for both children and families could be quite great. really quite concerning about the sort of contingency planning for free school meals. So while children are off, the government are encouraging schools to try and get food parcels out to families who are eligible for free school meals, but we sort of know that that's kind of very challenging in the sense of schools having to think about the logistics, potentially sort of whether those food parcels are adequate for children. There's kind of a lot of challenges that come with that, and it feels, you know, the government don't want to restart the voucher scheme, but it just feels like this hasn't been thought through, and I think that's what we're hearing from lots of schools as well, that they're not quite sure how to deliver free school meals alongside everything else that they're trying to do while children are back in school. And then finally, just this point that some families have reported sort of higher costs this year on returning to school. So that could be around kind of uniform and stricter uniform policies, or having to buy a whole kind of host of new items because children have grown out of things they were wearing back in March. Also, some of the policies sort of encourage buying your own pencil cases, water bottles, so that you're not having to share things, which makes sense from a kind of health and safety perspective. But then in terms of families on a low income, those additional costs just kind of add to that burden that families are feeling. So very quickly, these are kind of the points to take away, but just, yeah, I suppose having a broader understanding of the families that might be facing financial hardship is going to be important. Having very open conversations about resources and sort of trying to understand what's needed at home, and just more kind of, I guess, more government funding in general is needed around resources, because we've seen how important they are, kind of how important tech is. Very big point about sort of continuing to promote any financial entitlements to families, so they know what they're entitled to. And then that point from the beginning of just thinking about the school day from a poverty perspective, and just checking that policies and practices sort of support families rather than make matters kind of, or make it more difficult, I guess. There we go. Sorry, that was probably a bit long. I will stop sharing my screen, but please feel free to get in touch.
Well, all I can say is, wow, that was a fantastic contribution, Kate. Totally mind-boggled at this point. So what we're going to do now is move on to Rhiannon's contribution, and then we'll have some time for questions and answers, hopefully. But yeah, we're going to need to keep things a bit brief when we get to questions and answers, to make sure that we have enough time for Rhiannon to have her say. So, Rhiannon, would you like to come in and unmute?
Yeah, I think I'm unmuted. Hello, everybody. Hello again, Jo. I met you this morning. I didn't realise it was going to be the same person.
Hi, Rhiannon. You okay?
I'm good, thank you. Yeah, so I am branch secretary at Birmingham City University for UCU, but like I think a number of the speakers here, in a personal capacity, because UCU are not affiliated to the Labour Party, and so I'm, I suppose, here to talk about experiences within the context of further and higher education. As well as that, though, I'm a mum too. Solidarity to all of you working in schools at the moment. Our children, my son has had COVID in his school since about the third day back. My partner's son, who goes to school in Birmingham, has been self-isolating, just gone back 2 weeks. My daughter, who's at primary school, has just had an email over the weekend saying that one of her teachers is now self-isolating. So it does feel, as a parent, like the government really don't have control of it. I do feel very worried that teachers are being thrown under the bus in terms of what potentially will happen to them. And of course, there will be children with vulnerabilities who will catch it and then not make the same sort of recovery as other healthier young people. So it is a big worry, and I do want to send support to Social Education Association, NU, and so on. In terms of what's been going on for UCU, working in connection with the NEU, we set out 5 tests, very similar to them. First test was that there should be much lower numbers of COVID and a sustained downward trend. Obviously, as you'll be aware, in Birmingham, that's definitely not the case where we are based. There was, the second test was a national plan for social distancing, and I think really there's a number of different layers of what's going on here. for our members and for our students. So the headline stuff really, which I'm sure a lot of you will have seen, is that there's been big outbreaks at some of our campuses around the UK. Lots of student lockdowns with what seems like quite brutal trapping almost of students within their halls of residence without access to support. I think there's potentially a big mental health crisis coming for our students this year, having gone through lockdown as A-level or BTEC students, having had all the messing up of the A-level results and BTEC results and so on, contended with all that, to have these mixed messages from government to say that you can go out to the pub, you can have a good time, you should be feeding the economy by spending your money, then to go straight into a situation where there's going to be made the scapegoat for the fact that now we've got explosions of the virus in our halls of residences. So that is a big worry, and I think there's been a variety of different behaviours from different vice-chancellors, different heads of universities, but some of them have been completely immoral and completely abdicated responsibility. I was reading from a colleague at Leeds University about dogs being sent to break up student parties there, and I was just thinking, what on earth is happening? that is, it's almost like I can understand I suppose university leaders being very frustrated about student behaviours. What I can't understand is how they ever thought that it wasn't going to happen. Cannot understand in what kind of world our university leaders believed that young people would come straight from home, get independence, be surrounded by other young people but told they couldn't touch them, they couldn't go anywhere near them. It was never ever going to happen, and that students are now going to be blamed for that is really just a way of pushing the blame on from university leaders who were promising the world to students a few months ago because of the marketised nature of our university system and because our universities are in constant competition with each other over numbers. So because of the amount of money that comes in through having students commit, really they've been sold a very idealistic version of what this year would look like under COVID at university, and now almost being trapped away from family, away from people who care and support them. So that is horrific. At the same time, for my type of university, Birmingham City University, and for our FE colleges, there are some students in halls of residence at BCU, but the big issue really for social distancing for us, I think, is the fact that most of our students are commuter students. They don't live in halls of residences, but they will be using public transport, along with lots of young lower paid workers and people who are being forced back to the office. So even if at the university social distancing is generally going okay, the issue is that once students are outside of that, they don't really have a safe route in and out of university. A lot of them will be interconnected with other generations of the family, so often our students take care of younger siblings, or they are parents themselves, or they have care responsibilities with older people, and of course a lot of them are working as well in the local economy. And the whole thing is, it feels like, looking at Scotland, we're just 2 or 3 weeks behind there. In Scotland, you will perhaps have seen that there's a lot of universities going into pretty much a state of emergency because of the level. It feels like we're heading there as well. We asked for comprehensive testing. Obviously, that's not just higher and further education that don't have access to that, but the fact that there isn't testing across the education sector really means that we don't have that speed, the same as people who are working in schools have been talking about, in terms of being able to get somebody tested and then get them back into the workplace. The other issue, whole college or university strategy, I would say there has been some communication about how the university is tackling things at BCU, but at the same time, as part of the marketisation thing, they locked themselves in very early on to a pledge that 50% of teaching would happen in the classroom without really thinking about how that would be timetabled to allow for social distancing, and timetabling has been pretty much a mess at the start of the year. I would say that's caused a lot of stress for people. Final test, protection for the vulnerable. So similar, I think, to schools, we have a scenario now with our members where the shielding thing has gone. The university is still saying people with a COVID age of over 80 are able to work from home, but it has to be negotiated below that. And so there are particular issues for disabled members, I think, who previously would have been classed as clinically vulnerable, who now don't have an automatic right to work from home. There's definitely race issues as well. I think our Black members are very worried about the relative vulnerability and how that isn't really being considered nationally or at university level. And the other issue, I think, connected as well, are the other people at home, which is similar to schools as well. So the university says it's sympathetic to people who have shielding others at home, but just because somebody at home could catch a virus that you bring home from the university doesn't mean, from their point of view, that it's their responsibility. And they've said to us that they will try to facilitate things, but ultimately, if you live with somebody who could be really endangered by you being at work, you should make arrangements for them to move out and live somewhere else, which is obviously very unlikely for most people to be able to have the resources and the facilities to do that. BCU, I would say, are above our neighbours at University of Birmingham in terms of how the management have responded to things. So University of Birmingham have a very aggressive Vice-Chancellor, who you may have heard of in the past, David Eastwood. He has been pushing academic-related staff, so staff who don't even have to interact with students who could work from home, that they should be on campus to create an atmosphere of busyness and to make it seem like the place is buzzing. He's sent out threatening communications, either from him or his team. I need to look at it properly, but over the weekend, pretty much threatening people that they're not going to get their sick pay. If they are self-isolating with symptoms, they should be making arrangements to still be doing their work, which is pretty shocking. So yeah, University of Birmingham, I think, are a step beyond PCU in terms of how our members are being treated there. Colleges, I think, very similar situation to schools. So most deliveries going on campus. Similar to schools, but there's a lot of variety in how leaders are dealing with outbreaks. So I know at colleges that I worked in previously, rather than a whole bubble being sent home where a student has become sick, only they're asking the student to report who that student's had close contact with, and only say 3 or 4 people who've had close contact with that student, then being told that it's happened and being told to self-isolate, which seems a little reckless, because again, as much as I love students, I wouldn't necessarily at that age myself have told my teacher everybody who I'd had a snog with, or everybody who I had any kind of close contact with, because I think they feel pretty invincible, a lot of them, and it wouldn't seem like a big thing. We also represent prison educators, and I think they're probably dealing with the worst of the stresses that our members have had to deal with. I mean, prison educators have had health and safety issues for a long time before COVID, and so that has become something pretty much on breaking point at the moment. So just to finish off then, really, that's the situation from my personal experiences. I think just to echo some of the themes that have come out from what other people are saying, what it feels like is that people aren't being asked about how to work things in the education sector. And it also feels like a lot of stuff is being done on wishful thinking. So planning is being done for the absolute best behaviour to happen, or the absolute best possible R rate, without it really being planning that takes in the realities of what our members are dealing with and what our students are facing. And there's all sorts of different layers of problems. I think there's a whole class issue going on for university students. So on the one hand, we definitely want students to be safe and to not come in when that's going to endanger them. At the same time, we do have BCU and in FE a much more digital poverty than at universities like the University of Birmingham, so students are more likely to not have access to facilities to connect to online learning, And really, I think what we would like is for those students to be prioritised so that they could come in at a very small level onto campus if they need to, which was what was happening in the summer, rather than just a blanket face-to-face of everybody coming in for half of the time. And that would probably mean that those students were much safer when they are coming in to access technology. Yeah, so that was it.
Thank you very much, Rhiannon. You've included quite a lot there in a very timely manner. Thank you for that. So, who has questions for any of the three last speakers? As I said, if you can keep the questions concise and say who the question is for, that would be great. Have you got any questions? Can't see any raised hands. I'm sure that's not because it wasn't interesting. It's probably because we've all been mind boggled by the amount of information that we've just received. So I can see that we've just had a message from Sarah to say that she's put some information in the link scientific article that she mentioned earlier. So if nobody's got any questions, then I'll bring this meeting to a conclusion. I think it's been an absolutely fascinating evening. In some ways quite depressing, because it's the extent to which young people have been put in such a difficult situation. And the term that somebody used earlier, I'm not sure who it was who said that teachers have been thrown under a bus in terms of their health and safety in the workplace. And I was at a conference, a Zoom conference a couple of days ago, where we were talking about the impact of COVID that was specific to women in the lowest paid jobs, women in the least secure jobs, etc. And I think what we've just found is a whole new layer of the ways that COVID is affecting women. So women as teachers, who I think the majority of teachers are still women, the women who are having to stay at home as carers for their children who are normally able to get out of the house, the children of women who are in those low paid, insecure jobs. It just ripples out in every direction. And I was really glad to hear one of the speakers earlier, I think she's left now, saying that the key way to respond to all of this is through collective action and collective challenges to these situations. And hopefully, as this situation evolves and rolls forward, then more and more of the trade unions and other organisations, other campaigning groups will come on board with these challenges. And I have to say, if I had school-age children at the moment, I'm really not sure they'd be in a classroom. And I think that I would be quite happy to be sort of taken to court and have my day in court over that. I have over other things. But the idea that children are being forced to go into a situation where they are at risk and everybody knows that they're at risk, and where teachers and other staff in education are being expected to go into those situations, whilst at the same time being the people who are affected most in other ways, economically and socially, is quite eye-opening. And I hope that people watch this video when it's made available and are able to take some learning from that, so that they can support the campaigns that we hope will come in the very near future. So thank you to all of our speakers for this evening. Thank you all for joining us, and I look forward to seeing you all in the very near future in our campaign and our programme of meetings. So, and thank you for Ruth Clark in particular for joining us this evening from London. So, goodbye everybody.